A lot of women navigating perimenopause want to jump straight to hormone testing. But if you do that before checking some of these foundational type labs, you could be missing what's actually driving a lot of your symptoms. As a nutritional therapy practitioner who helps women navigate perimenopause, I'm going to show you the labs that I want to see before testing hormones. Yes, during perimenopause, hormones do start to decline, but they also swing pretty wildly and they don't operate in isolation. We are talking about one whole system, and sometimes that decline in hormones actually starts uncovering some things that it may have been compensating for so much in the past. The blood markers I'm talking about today are typically not on the standard panel that your doctor will run just at your annual checkup. These are things outside of like a CBC, comprehensive metabolic panel, or even checking your basic cholesterol levels. Those tests can be incredibly useful, but they are designed more to diagnose disease rather than check on dysfunction. Another really important piece of that is how the labs are interpreted. Again, a lot of conventional medicine is looking at them to be able to diagnose and treat disease, which is much different than looking at them at a functional or optimal level. Plus, the lab ranges that are included in some of those conventional labs are based on the general population. 90% of the population is metabolically unhealthy. So I don't know about you, but I don't want my labs to be compared to a sick population. I want to feel good and I want what is optimal for my health, not what is average in a sick population. So what's normal does not necessarily mean optimal. Perimenopause is definitely one of those times where the margin of error really starts to shrink, and that difference between a lab range and an optimal range can make a huge difference in how you feel. You can get away with some of these things being less than optimal when you're in your 20s and your 30s. But when estrogen declines, which is very protective and is sort of like our fairy godmother, those cracks really start to show and show up as symptoms. Often they're the symptoms that are also correlated with perimenopause. So it's confusing to know which is which. Is this because of a hormone issue, or are there some imbalances that are going on that are driving these symptoms? And if those things aren't addressed first, hormone testing or addressing hormones or things like HRT might not do too much to actually move the needle to make you feel better. So the labs that I'm going to walk you through today are what I would consider foundational labs that are really important during this perimenopausal timeframe, in addition to a lot of the standard labs that you get run at your doctor. Because this tells us how your body is functioning before we start talking about hormones. If they're off significantly or even off by a little, testing hormones or doing HRT are not going to give women the results that they're hoping for. I can't possibly cover every single important lab today, but I am going to walk you through 5 categories or little families of blood markers outside of your normal blood work that can often explain why women are feeling awful or are the first signs that something is stressing the body out in a way that adding more hormones on isn't necessarily going to fix it. The first is thyroid function beyond TSH. Thyroid dysfunction is incredibly common in women and is also one of the most commonly missed drivers of perimenopause symptoms. And part of the reasons for this is that in a lot of the routine blood work, only TSH or TSH plus T4 are checked. But those 2 markers alone oftentimes isn't enough. TSH is the thyroid stimulating hormone. And what that is the hormone that's coming from your brain to your thyroid, telling your thyroid to make more thyroid hormone. But what TSH does not tell us is how much of the thyroid hormone is available to cells in the body, or even if your body is properly using it. Many women have normal TSH, but feel terrible. They have fatigue, they have cold hands, cold feet, or they're anxious, or they're gaining weight and they're not sure why. And that's because what's actually driving metabolism, energy, and a lot of hormone production is the active form of thyroid hormone, which is T3. Most of the hormone that your thyroid produces is T4, and that's another reason why measuring TSH and T4 isn't that accurate, because T4 has to be converted to T3 in order for your body to use it. And this conversion is extremely sensitive to things like stress, inflammation, nutrient deficiencies, and blood sugar issues. And these are all things that tend to worsen in perimenopause or even just in this age range as our body just isn't quite as resilient as it used to be. As estrogen declines, thyroid hormone availability can change. At the same time in this life stage, We're oftentimes more stressed, we're sleeping less, like sleep can be a little bit more difficult during this time. So many women are under eating and potentially dealing with years of nutrient depletion, which makes that T4 to T3 conversion much less efficient. There's also a lab called reverse T3, which is essentially like a braking system. When your body is under chronic stress or inflammation, it's a bit of a defense mechanism to instead convert that T4 into the active form of T3. It converts it into something called reverse T3. It shuttles it into that, which then will help slow metabolism and slow the body function down to help preserve resources. So on paper, if you're looking at TSH or T4, everything can look normal. But on a cellular level, your body is actually running on a low power mode to help conserve resources. And another part that's missed, especially when it comes to thyroid, is the autoimmune piece, and that's thyroid antibodies. Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition, is extremely common in women, and it often shows up during hormonal transitions like perimenopause. And thyroid antibodies can be elevated for years before we start to see any irregularities in TSH or T4. Thyroid function and perimenopause share a very long list of overlapping symptoms. If you don't check your thyroid, it's very easy to just assume that it's perimenopause, when in reality, it's an underperforming thyroid or a poor thyroid conversion that's actually driving how you feel. This is why I never look at TSH alone or even just TSH and T4 in isolation. I want the whole entire picture. The next foundational area that I like to look at before running hormones is your iron status. And this is more than just looking at ferritin. Ferritin is important, but similar to thyroid, it's not the full picture. Iron is a system in your body, and to understand how that's functioning, we need to look not only at storage, which is ferritin, but also availability. Ferritin tells us how much your body has stored. It is one of the earlier markers to drop when iron is being depleted, and that can be long before anemia ever shows up. And low ferritin alone can cause a lot of issues that overlap with perimenopause, like fatigue, hair loss, brain fog, restless legs, cold intolerance, and mood changes, even if your hemoglobin is completely normal. Most lab ranges are pretty broad for this one and consider normal to be anywhere in the teens up to 150. But from a functional perspective, many women don't feel good unless their ferritin is somewhere between 50 and 100. This is very generally speaking, and some may need it to be even 70 or higher. Again, this is the difference between having something that's diagnosable as some sort of disease or condition versus having enough reserves to feel and function well. And again, ferritin is only a piece of the picture. It tells us storage, not what's available for use. This is when a more comprehensive iron panel can be really helpful. With things like serum iron, which is a snapshot of how much iron is floating in your bloodstream. TIBC is a marker that tells us your body's desire for more iron. It's kind of like the seats on the bus available to be able to carry iron. The more seats there are, the stronger your body's demand is for more iron. And then there's something called transferrin saturation or iron saturation, and that tells us how many of those seats are filled with iron. We don't want it super low. We also don't want it super high. We want it somewhere in the middle. And looking at these markers together gives us a much more full picture to tell us, is there a true iron deficiency, or is there more of a pattern where iron is present, but it's not being properly utilized? Whether that be that ferritin is really, really high and iron within the blood is low, or iron in the blood is high and storage is low. Without understanding these pieces, we could be completely missing what is driving some of this dysfunction or how it's managed. And perimenopause is one of those higher risk times of iron depletion. Many women have heavier periods or more frequent periods and shorter cycles, which can drain iron stores and feel a whole lot like perimenopause symptoms. And others, even if all is well right now with the cycle, we've had decades and decades of menstruation behind us and may not have really ever fully repleted iron. Iron is required for so many processes across the body that even a slight deficiency can feel pretty horrible in causing problems across the body, like thyroid function, energy, inflammation, and also completely kill our stress tolerance, which is also likely not great at this time. The next foundational area that I always like to look at in a comprehensive way is blood sugar. And of course, fasting glucose is typically added. And sometimes if you're lucky, you also get hemoglobin A1C that's added onto your blood work. But what's often missing is fasting insulin. And a common misconception is that blood sugar issues are really only a problem if you're hitting that pre-diabetic or diabetic stage. And because of this, oftentimes only that fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C are measured. But insulin resistance oftentimes happens for years before someone is considered pre-diabetic or diabetic. Insulin is the hormone that allows your glucose into the cells. And so when that starts to bump up, that's telling us that our cells are less responsive to insulin. And so the body just continues to pump out more. On paper, maybe your glucose is looking fine, but the amount of insulin that your pancreas is having to pump out is starting to really creep up. And blood sugar issues have a lot of overlap with perimenopause symptoms. Things like fatigue and weight gain, especially around the belly, cravings, energy crashes, inflammation, and difficulty losing weight despite doing all the right things. And again, this can happen long before diabetes is even on the radar. So if we don't look here first to kind of check this box, we can assume that the hormones are the problem, when really your body's ability to handle glucose efficiently is actually the problem. So this is why, in addition to fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C, I like to see fasting insulin. I like to see those three together. Fasting glucose is a moment of time of how much glucose is in your bloodstream. When you are at a fasted level, you should not have as much glucose circulating in your system. And so if your glucose is a little bit too high, that tells us that your body isn't able to remove it and shuttle it where it needs to go properly. Hemoglobin A1C is sort of like a report card. Instead of looking at one snapshot of a moment in time, it's looking at about a 3-month average of glucose levels within the blood. And of course, that one can be a little tricky because if there's some red blood cell issues going on there, that can also skew that number, but generally speaking, that's what it's supposed to tell us. And then fasting insulin shows us how hard your body is having to work in order to clear the glucose out of the blood and get it to normal levels. And one of my many problems with some of the lab ranges is that for fasting insulin, the mid-20s is even what's considered normal. And from a functional standpoint, we want it much lower than that. It would be best to be around the 5 to 7 range. And again, this is because insulin resistance can show up long before we start to see some of those blood sugar related diseases. The same thing applies to hemoglobin A1C. Even values that are technically considered normal are higher than what we'd like it to be. From a functional standpoint, we typically want to see it between 5 and 5.4. During this life stage of perimenopause, many women may not have had any history of blood sugar issues at all. But at this point, when estrogen starts to decline, it makes it more difficult to regulate glucose because your body becomes less insulin sensitive. Estrogen helps improve sensitivity of insulin, meaning the cells are more responsive to insulin when we have more robust levels of estrogen. And then if you add in stress and poor sleep, under eating, loss of muscle, years of dieting, a lot of time that insulin resistance then just accelerates. So it's great to look here first before we go chasing hormones. Hey, if you found this helpful at all, I would love it if you would hit like, subscribe, or share it with a friend. It helps more women find this type of information during this very confusing life stage. Thank you. The next foundational piece that I always want to look at with women in this age range is inflammation. Inflammation is one of those things that quietly affects everything: metabolism, mood, energy, hormones, and long-term disease risk. And it can be pretty sneaky because chronic low-grade inflammation can be hanging around and you don't feel sick or you don't feel like you have an infection. And one of the simplest, most sensitive ways to be able to measure this is through a marker called high sensitivity C-reactive protein, or HSCRP. This measures the protein that your liver makes when inflammation is in the body. And it's much more sensitive than the common standard marker of C-reactive protein alone. From a functional standpoint, we want high sensitivity C-reactive protein to be 1 or lower. Values between 1 and 3 start to tell us that there's some inflammatory burden going on, which can significantly increase metabolic risk when everything else seems to be normal. And estrogen has a lot of anti-inflammatory effects. So when it's starting to swing so wildly, that's when we can start to see some of these inflammatory markers start to go up because we no longer have this cover up of anti-inflammatory activity. The body simply has less buffering to be able to cover some of these things up. And inflammation can worsen insulin resistance. It can mess with thyroid hormone conversion. It affects your iron utilization. It also messes with brain and neurotransmitters, and can even screw up how your body metabolizes estrogen, which, yes, it's going down. You think you want more of it, but you also want it to be escorted out when we're done with it. Because HSCRP is not part of the routine blood work that's ordered at an annual exam or an annual checkup, many women never see this piece of the puzzle. When inflammation is high, hormone replacement therapy might not work that well because inflammation affects your hormone receptors and signaling. So lowering inflammation on its own can significantly reduce some symptoms that people are feeling and creates that better foundation if you do choose to use hormone replacement therapy in the future. The next foundational area that I like to look at is nutrient status status across a couple key areas. Again, because hormones don't work in a vacuum and they need raw materials in order to function properly. And even a slight deficiency in these can cause some pretty big dysfunction. First one is vitamin D. Many of us are familiar with this. It plays roles across the body in many different ways: immune system, bone health, mood, muscle strength, cardiovascular health, hormone signaling. And deficiencies here are super common, especially for those who live in more northern climates with less sun exposure during certain times of the year, or those that have gut or autoimmune issues. There are many varying opinions on what levels are appropriate, but I typically like to see it between the range of 30 and 70. And some might feel better even at 50 or higher, especially if autoimmune issues are at play for you. B12 is another one. This is often driven by lower stomach acid production as we age. And this one's super important for energy production, brain function, neurotransmitters, and being low can cause a range of issues that feel similar to perimenopause symptoms like fatigue, brain fog, memory issues, mood issues, numbing, tingling, and this can go unnoticed or kind of like dismissed for years. Magnesium is another huge one. It is involved in hundreds of processes across the body, and it is one of the first minerals to be depleted when we are stressed. The problem with testing is that only 1% of our magnesium is in our blood. So running something called RBC magnesium actually measures the magnesium in a cell, which is a much more accurate measure of magnesium status across the body. There are also a lot of patterns that you can see when you do some of the standard panels that your doctors are running. For example, on your complete blood count, you can get a really good gauge on B vitamin status, on iron status, but these markers are often not run, so that's where I wanted to mention them here too. And nutrient deficiencies are one of those things that are great to catch before it causes disease and conditions across the body, but they can often show up as symptoms. Perimenopause is one of those times when the nutrient deficiencies are starting to really catch up with us. We can't expect our bodies to work well if we do not give them the raw materials to do their jobs. And when we step back and look at all of these things together, when we're looking at thyroid function, iron status, inflammation, blood sugar regulation, and nutrient status, they're not separate issues. They're all interconnected systems across the body. And when one is off, it puts pressure on all of the others. And the symptoms of that pressure can feel so similar to a lot of the symptoms that we feel in this age range. And then that loss of estrogen really just fans the flames and can make you feel worse, but simply adding on more estrogen isn't going to fix the problem. Hormones are absolutely a part of the picture in this age range, but they sit on top of these foundational pieces. If the foundations are not strong, adding in or adjusting more hormones is not going to give us the results that we're hoping for, nor is it addressing some of the foundational issues of why it's a problem to begin with. And this is why I absolutely recommend starting with blood work before running hormones, even though it can feel so tempting. And if you do decide to run the hormones along with some of this blood work, use it more as a benchmark, but not the cause of what you are seeing on your blood work. Videos can only be so long. I really scratched the surface here. Are there any of these areas that you want me to go more in depth on? I'd love to hear it. Let me know in the comments. And if you want a more in-depth look on some of the foundational systems that also impact hormone production and regulation, I highly recommend you check out my Perimenopause Playbook series right here. It gives a little more detail on each of these foundational areas and more. All right, you got this, and I'm here with you every step of the way. See you in the next one.